today we are very lucky. This came together rather quickly. We are graced with the presence of Mr. Toby Ball, who does a podcast called Strange Arrivals for Grim and Mild, which is about UFO history. And I got turned on to this by Monster Talk. Toby was on that podcast. If anybody's a fan, if you're not, you should be. And I got to admit, listening to it, I wasn't sure what I was going to think of the podcast, because it kind of sounded like the way Blake Smith characterized it. It kind of sounded like Toby was kind of playing it down the middle, and he does. But I won't spoil it too much. We can get into it, but you can definitely see his true crime background coming out, and there's a reason I invited him to come talk to us today. So, Toby, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Toby Ball. I've been in podcasting since 2014. Most of that time, I've been a panelist on a show called Crime Writers On, which it's a panel conversation about crime and true crime and popular culture. So we review a lot of other podcasts and documentaries, TV shows, things like that. And then, I don't know, 3 years ago, I guess at this point, I reviewed so many podcasts and thought that maybe I should make one myself to sort of figure out how that all goes and what decisions you have to make and all this stuff. So I started making, I wanted to do something about skepticism and belief. And I can actually remember the exact moment I was kind of trying to figure out how I was going to do something about that, because I was waiting to get some dental surgery. And I live in Durham.
Which is Betty and Barney Hill's house?
Yeah, exactly. And Barney had a little dental issue on the flying saucer. I live in Durham. At the time, I was working at the University of New Hampshire, which has the Betty and Barney Hill archives. So I realized that without, having to travel too far, I had this like large sort of trove of information that I could use. And so what I did is I kind of I was just going to put together an independent thing, release it, maybe a few hundred people would listen to it or whatever. I was actually at a podcast conference, and the producer for the Crime Writers show knows Aaron Mahnke and sort of pitched my show to him. He listened to the sort of rough cuts of what I had. And so he has a deal with iHeart Radio to executive produce some podcasts. So he brought me on for that. And then it just really expanded, it went from being like a 5-part sort of rudimentary podcast to, once you get professional producers and, you get the iHeart name behind you, you can get a lot more people to talk to you. Yeah, Joel, you have a question? I think you're muted.
Joel's muted. We'll come back to him. Go ahead.
Okay.
No, it's okay. You said something about a Betty something or other archive. Could you say what that is? I've never heard
sure.
of that.
So University of New Hampshire has the Betty and Barney Hill archives. So, my understanding is that it was created, they were both very active in the civil rights movement in the 60s in our area of New Hampshire. So I think it was originally set up for that, and then quickly became overwhelmed by the UFO stuff. But you go down to the special collections, and it's by far the most visited thing in the collections. And, there's an Exeter UFO conference in the summer, and they just get this like parade of people coming through.
So it's a pro UFO.
No, I don't think it's really. I don't think it's really anything. It's just literally just their papers, So
okay.
you can read letters that Betty sent to different people. They have the bust that's called Junior that was sculpted based on basically Betty's recollections of what she saw. I mean, there's a lot of interesting kind of artifacts, and they have a nice little exhibit, like a glass and exhibit that you can go and take a look at some of the dress, the stained dress that has now got all these little squares cut out of it that were sent to labs for testing. So anyway, so that's kind of where, so the first season was on Betty and Barney Hill, but I sort of expanded to talk about, memory and hypnosis.
Well,
and then
let's back up a little bit.
Oh, okay, sure.
So how did you, I gotta ask the usual question I always get to ask. Joel asked me an origin question earlier, so I gotta ask you, how did you get interested in UFOs?
Yeah, so I think 70% of 8 to 12-year-old boys or possibly girls too. I was friends with boys mostly at the time. UFOs, and this is in like the 70s, late 70s, UFOs, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, all that stuff. I was 100% into. And then we lived on the East Coast, in New Jersey, and then in upstate. My grandparents lived in Albuquerque, and one of their sort of family friends was Ken Frazier. I don't know if that's a name people know, but he's the editor of the Skeptical Inquirer.
Of course, magazine. Kendrick Frazier, yeah.
Yeah, so I used to see him every Christmas.
Wow, that is interesting.
So I would kind of, what about this? What about that? What about the other thing? And, you kind of, patiently give me the skeptical take on things and sort of, how do you look at these things kind of rationally? So that was kind of my sort of introduction to this stuff. But, it's one of those things that I've always, like, at various times, stages in life, I've had friends who are kind of like into UFO stuff to a certain extent. Like, we would sometimes, when I was living in DC, we'd go to like the Blockbuster and rent like old episodes of In Search Of, like hang around and drink beer and watch them. So that's kind of where it was. And then, so when I was thinking about making a podcast, it just seemed cool that maybe spend some time like sort of diving deep into the Betty and Barney Hill story.
So preparing for Strange Arrivals, was that like your first return to thinking a lot about UFOs, or was there like a moment where like a switch flipped where you went from a little more believing to a little more skeptical? Was it a gradual thing?
Yeah, I don't think I ever really believed that we were being visited. I mean, again, you talk to Ken Frazier and, he'll convince you that we're not. But I was, I think, UFOs are interesting, I think, and I think the fact that my belief is that they're not visiting from other planets and stuff, but I think that the fact that that's true actually makes them even more interesting to a certain extent. It's like, why do so many people think they do? Why is it a persistent myth? How do you account for what's going on right now with all these, quote unquote UFO videos that are being released? So I think it's funny. I wrote 3 novels about 10 years ago, and I talked to my agent about writing a UFO novel. So I was like, I think UFOs might be coming back. He was like, nah, that's not it. But clearly it'd be nice to have a UFO novel in the bank right now to trot out. But anyway.
I wonder if that's the next. Weird area of romance fiction.
yeah. Alien.
It's kind of built in a weird way, in a frightening way. So it sounds like you were. I mean, I think I'm the same way. I think a lot of us were the same. Although I was a serious believer. Although I wasn't so much. Traveling through space seemed too far-fetched to me. But all the stories that I bought completely. So I was very much a Jacques Vallée believer. So I was like, oh, they must be another dimension or something like that. But I think a lot of us were into this stuff early on, and then kind of, I don't know, graduated to a more skeptical view. But you're right, it is still interesting, and I think I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, because the word mythology comes up in Strange Arrivals a lot, and different guests, different interview subjects of yours use it in different ways. But it really is, the whole UFO lore really is a modern mythology. And it's like, you can be interested in, like, say, Greek mythology without thinking that Zeus is literally real, right?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I don't know how, if we want to dive into different things now, but that, especially in the second season of Strange Arrivals, it was, you know, how did we get from 1947 to where we are now with what sort of
really, yeah, you're right. That is really amazing. But yeah, so let's start at the start. Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Okay.
So I started listening to Strange Arrival, and at first 5 episodes or so are pretty much a straight up retelling of the seminal American experience, the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. And it's really gripping. And I assume this comes from your true crime background, because you splice in clips from the actual hypnosis sessions that they both had, which is, if you're a person who's given to be swayed by emotional things, I can definitely see how you'd be swayed by that, because Barney's accounts especially are terrifying. But then it's really weird. It's like you get to a certain point, and then all of a sudden you start hearing interviews with Robert Sheaffer and Steve Lundquist, who is a friend of ours over in New Hampshire Skeptics, and et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden, I liken it to a Scooby-Doo episode. All of a sudden, you're pulling the mask off, and oh my God, here's the real culprit. And I think that's just, I'm always trying to think of ways to communicate skepticism to people outside of our little bubble. So this is just really amazing to me, because it seemed like you, again, using kind of like, you could tell me how much you were really thinking of true crime when you did this. Maybe it's just me superimposing it, but it's like you're telling this scary story purported to be real, just pulling people, you got the spooky music and everything, pulling people in, getting them invested, and being like, okay, but here's what we really know about it, and here's what some other people think might have happened. Is that deliberate?
Yeah, no, I think there's two things kind of going on. One is you're right about the true crime model, which is you kind of tell what happened. You kind of give the narrative, and then you go back and you kind of start interrogating the details, right? And that's how a lot of true crime things work. It's like, is this person reliable? What about this? What about that? And then the other thing I think is, sort of dissecting and trying to find the truth behind a story that's not that interesting is not in itself very interesting. So I think in order to set up the, sciencey part of it, you have to tell a compelling story, and a story that seems convincing, where people are like, what, this seems like, how can this not be true? How can this story have been, how could they misconstrue things to come up with this story? So I think that was kind of the thing, is you kind of want somebody who's coming in cold to, after whatever episode it was, and I think it starts to transition a little bit when we start talking about the star map. I want them to get to the end and be like, oh my God, that is a totally compelling story. I don't know how you can impeach it. And then that's when you start taking a look at it a little more closely. And, what does science tell us? What do people who are like serious investigators tell us? And then kind of peel it away. And I think that's what makes it interesting for listeners, I think. And that's why, in both seasons, I spend, 2, 3, 4 episodes with as much as possible getting the people who experience them, or people who are close to them, or archival footage, so that it's told as close as possible to the person's own voice before, again, jumping in with, Robert Sheaffer and, all those others to kind of give the explanation for what was actually going on.
Yeah. And it's really because people our age, I grew up in the 90s. That was the height of my UFO fandom, I guess, if you want to put it that way. all the interesting stuff had kind of already happened at that point, or it seemed to be kind of happening at that point. So it's kind of like, well, we talked about comic books earlier. Joel was asking me questions. I listen to this podcast called Marvel by the Month, where they literally go back to the very beginning and read each comic that came out in that month, starting at whatever it was, July 63. And every episode, they do another month. And it's really helpful for the context, because when you come into things later, you just kind of get bombarded with a bunch of different stuff and you don't really understand how it all unfolded. And I think starting with the Betty and Barney Hill abduction and just walking through that particular case, and then, like you said, talking to different experts and then looking at each piece of evidence in kind, rather than, reading something in this blog, reading something from this book, it's really helpful to understand, because it does seem remarkable at first. How could these people, they're not crazy people, they're probably telling something that actually happened to them. How can they misconstrue it, misunderstand it that bad? And then you bring the people in and address each individual point, and then suddenly it's not so weird.
Van Gogh?
So that is making and preparing of the one of his, but he considers
I'm getting a lot of.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Got it.
Right. I'm sorry. So what was the question? I kind of got lost.
I was asking if you could comment on the importance of context and taking things step by step, like you have.
Yeah. So, and I think for the Hills story, it is so kind of segmented. There's just different parts of it, which require different ways of looking at it, right? So there's this initial night where they feel as though they're being followed by something in the sky, and then it becomes, it goes from being a light in the sky that they think is following them to like an actual like physical object that they see at various times, and then Barney thinks he sees actual, beings inside this. So that's one segment of it. Another segment of it is this lost time and what they get hypnotically recovered. So in some ways, it's like you're looking at two different kind of mysteries, and one hinges on the other. So what I the sort of substance of it, the way it was laid out, was kind of the story that happened that they remembered, and then you go to the hypnosis, and then you talk about why the hypnosis testimony is really suspect, and then goes back and talks about why, what the alternative explanation for their journey could be. And there's not like a total consensus about what they saw. I mean, it's sort of, there's a few different theories, which I think, I've got in my mind, like how it stitches together and works. And I think there's a little bit of weakness in the explanation at the end, where it's a lot of like, well, they were tired and freaked out, and that's why they, misconstrued a giant inflatable pumpkin for a UFO. But so that was kind of, so as far as contextualizing that way, that was one thing. I think another thing that I thought was interesting, I mean, I think that one of the things about the Betty and Barney Hill story is the staying power it has and how influential it has been, from, it's just, it's a couple from Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1961, and they somehow created, not on purpose. Like, I don't think anybody thinks they're just making this up to fool people, but they somehow created this story that has become the basis for a hell of a lot of UFO stuff. I mean, without them, you don't have the Andreessen thing or any, Travis Walton, all the way up through Bud Hopkins.
That's the other thing about context, is by laying out Betty and Barney Hill the way you did, and talking about hypnosis and what we know about it now, as opposed to basically nothing back in the 60s, it recontextualizes the entire alien abduction phenomenon after you finish with the Hills, you go to that. You go to the 80s and the 90s with Bud Hopkins and John Mack. And it really kind of puts things all in perspective. And to go back to that word mythology, it's when, like we were saying before, when you come at it all at once, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around it. But when you look at it sequentially, you can understand how this one giant thing built from all these other things that came before it, right?
Yeah. So in sort of the, abduction encounter kind of timeline, where Betty and Barney Hill sort of fall is between, the contactees, quote unquote contactees from the 50s, who like George Adamski and guys like that, who were meeting like human aliens from like Venus and Mars, who are coming to tell us to like, we're keeping our eye on you, but you need to be peaceful and all this stuff. And they're like attractive and like, they're sort of like hippies, it seems like. And, Adamski had already been running this weird sort of church, science fiction-y church. And, the aliens basically said exactly what he said in his church. So it goes from this kind of cartoon stuff to, Betty and Barney Hill have this encounter that's, just very different in kind. Like it really is, in their telling, an encounter with the uncanny. It's not something that you recognize from other things. That kind of leads to these, in my sort of telling of it, these sort of escalations. Like you can't tell the same abduction story again and again and have people be interested in it. So, Betty Andreasson like mixes in her like strong religious beliefs and has these aliens taking her on a tour of sort of alien heaven and hell.
Give us a little background on the Andreasson.
Okay, so Betty Andreasson was from I think it's Ashburton, Massachusetts, and she's very religious, and so she had this story that it's been a while since I've revisited this, but she was essentially in her house and some little aliens came in, and she was abducted by these two aliens whose names were Quasga and Juhop. And they took her onto their spaceship and they took off for into the galaxy. And they went to two different planets, one of which was like red and had these like crawling lizard or salamander like creatures. And, it was pretty clearly like her sort of conception of what hell looked like. And then they went to another one, which was green and, beautiful and all this stuff is, the Emerald City, which seemed pretty clearly her conception of heaven. And then she returns and they give her a book, which then disappears, but it's got all this sort of religious imagery about it, right? So she's taken the Betty and Barney Hill story and sort of layered on, her Christian beliefs and come up with this new story. And it was, I'm going to forget the guy's name, but it was championed by, one of those UFO writers who was fairly prolific at the time.
Was this, how far removed from Betty and Barney Hill are we at this point?
I think this is maybe later 60s. Okay. I think this is after the book came out, The Interrupted Journey, but not too far after. So maybe like 68 or 69. And
was her experience big news at that time, or did that not really come up until later?
I don't know what it was like. I mean, it certainly was out there at the time. There's, I found radio interviews with the guy who wrote the book about it and was sort of serving as their sort of PR person, I guess. But it wasn't like Betty and Barney Hill. I mean, there's Betty, if you can even go online into archive.com and find, radio shows where they're on the radio with Carl Sagan and other like prominent scientists talking about their, like a weird, I mean, it's sort of mind bending to think about it at this point, but you had like very, very prominent scientists talking to Betty and Barney Hill about whether they actually were abducted by UFOs. Like, did you actually meet with aliens? It's really strange. So anyway, and then after, there's Travis Wall, and there's all these stories that people have heard, but I think it kind of comes to sort of in the podcast, what I talk about is, you keep having this one-upsmanship until you get to Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs and John Mack, who are basically like, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are being abducted by aliens, and most people don't remember it, but we can give you a survey and we can interpret the results to tell you whether you have been and you just don't have the memories anymore. And, they all have a dispute about whether they're here for good or for evil. But it's just, it's you sort of reach the apex. Like, where do you go from there? There's no place for that story to go anymore. And it just kind of crumbles. And maybe I'm not aware of it, but I haven't heard much about alien abductions recently. I mean, that doesn't seem to be.
That was I want to get more to this later, but you're right. I mean, in all the flurry of UFO talk now, at least in the public side, it's probably a little different when you get deep down into the real researchers and the real believers. But at least from a public perspective, it almost seems like we've gone back to the 60s or even the 50s, where like, oh, what are these strange craft in our sky? And like forgetting all that other weird mythology. But yeah, I was coincidentally enough, I was watching the most recent season of American Horror Story while I was listening to your podcast. And if you don't know, I'll see if I can find a link here, but the last 4 episodes of American Horror Story were about, again, the UFO lore. And it was basically like, it was only 4 episodes and they threw in about as many references as you can imagine. And one of them, so the first episode, it's split between the 50s and the present day. And in the present day, 4 teenagers, early 20s, whatever they are, get abducted. And again, we're getting into the 90s view of alien abduction, where they're all impregnated to make hybrids for the aliens. There's the article I ended up writing in the chat. And when I say all of them, I mean both women and both men also. And I watched that and I was like, wow, so they're going way beyond even the original UFO lore. But then listening to your podcast, I never read David Jacobs when I was a kid. I read Mack, I read Hopkins, but I never got around to Jacobs. And then you said that he actually believed, he had people who recounted the tale of men being implanted with, I think the word you used was, I don't know if this was his word or not, what was it? Extra gestational devices.
Yeah, that was not my term.
Yeah, like literally unbelievable. Like talking about escalation. How do you get to that point?
Yeah, it's weird. Like it's definitely strange, and I think, but it again, it goes back to Betty and Barney Hill. Like Betty Hill talks about being on the spaceship. And they put something into her abdomen. They put a needle into her abdomen, and she takes it to be some kind of pregnancy test. And that this sort of begins this narrative of aliens being interested in reproduction, right? And so it goes when you get to the 90s, and you get Robert Sheaffer calls them the Troika.
Yeah.
And Mack, Hopkins, and Jacobs. And it's especially in Hopkins, because I focus a little bit more on Hopkins, partly because I talked to Carol Rainey, who's his ex-wife and ex-research partner, which
by the way, just to interrupt for a second, you have in between your seasons, you've got the Betty and Barney Hill season, and then you've got a season about Rendlesham Forest, which you may talk a little bit about soon. But kind of in between, you basically post like the entire interview that you did with certain subjects for the season, and the one with Bud Hopkins' wife, ex-wife, is really, really enlightening. If you're picking and choosing between Strange Arrivals episodes, I suggest focusing on that one, because that she was there as it all happened. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the same thing. As I think that's a really, it's easy for me to say because I was just interviewing her. She was the one who was saying everything. But she's got really interesting insights into what's going on. But my sense was, and I talk about this a little bit in the podcast, is, for Bud Hopkins, I think he felt like a real threat from, he's a modern artist. He's an arts and humanities type of guy. And I think he was feeling a lot of threat from the advancement of technology and what was sort of valued in society and stuff. So what he kind of comes up with is these, cold, clinical alien species, and that have like their sort of vulnerability. And one of the reasons why they're abducting people is that they can't show emotions. They can't nurture infants. So they're having these alien human hybrid babies that they can't provide any sort of emotional succor or whatever. So they're abducting people to come and sort of cuddle with the babies so that they don't, grow up to be sociopaths or something. That's sort of his, that's kind of his take. And it's very strange, but it is taking that initial sort of template from 1961 and creating something, again, at the end of this long period of escalation, but that kind of makes sense for who they are and at the time and what's going on around them.
Yeah, it's weird though. And like the point that strikes me after putting it all together is that, I mean, it was true even then, you could think of it, but even more when you, again, take it all in context, is that these beings are basically godlike. They can travel through space, which is, as far as we can tell, as far as Einstein can tell, is pretty much impossible. And you even mentioned in the podcast, going between Betty and Barney Hill and all of this, that they went from, having to pick people off on mountain roads late at night to literally being able to walk through your walls. Like nobody's safe anymore. Now they can just come in and unnoticed by anyone and just come in and take you. But basically super beings. And yet with all of this, they can't figure out a little selective breeding. They're here for decades, according to the Troika, as you said, experimenting and using thousands, if not millions of people, and they just can't figure out hybrids. It's like, what a weird disconnect.
Yeah, and it's it's mythology, right? It doesn't make logical sense necessarily. It's more sort of metaphorical sense, I guess.
And
Joel,
right.
did you have a question, Joel?
I'll unmute him.
Okay.
Joel, you're still on mute.
Okay. I've been listening to you and my head is swimming. And I didn't think
it's normal.
That I did. Well, yeah, but this is extra.
No, I mean, that's normal. That's normal for hearing all this stuff.
But now it's extra. It's beyond that. And, before this conversation started, I thought that I really didn't have much of this in my life. And I'm discovering that it's a really big chunk of my life. Not the major parts, thank God, if you want to believe in God, but and I made a list of the different things that you mentioned and the different areas, and it's more than 15. I think it's probably more than 20 different things. And I'm not going to read the list, but, it goes from things like science to secret organizations and stuff I would say is kind of borderline Freudianism. You didn't mention mental health, though. A couple things that you didn't mention. It's really astounding and it astounded me to read that list. If you wanted, I could read it, but
the hills. The Hills actually did go to a psychiatrist. That's where the hypnosis.
But I just want to finish this point. I grew up with Long John Nebel.
Yeah.
This is such a complicated, interwoven notion of religion, science, obsessions, mental illness, government plots. I haven't even scratched this. I barely scratched the surface of my list. I think this is one phenomenon, right? Even mythology, is in there. And, it's amazing how many different ways culture has, or complicated culture has fed into this, but also the reverse. How much, this is fed into things that we ordinarily, or at least I do, think of as somehow separated. And by the way, I did meet, I'm surprised even to remember this because I wasn't involved in this, was I once met, I guess it was about 2 weeks worth of seeing him every day, Bud Hopkins, because I installed a really incoherent exhibition when I was assistant curator at the Queen's Museum. It wasn't my choice, by the way. So, in other words, this is such a vast and complicated phenomenon. And
yeah, well,
I'm just saying, I wish you could bring some kind of way of tying all of that up together. I don't know if it's possible.
Not to sound like too much of a shill for Toby, Joel, but listen to the podcast because it really does. I mean, you don't, obviously, Toby, you don't cover everything yet. I mean, I don't know how a person could cover everything, to your point, Joel, but it really does kind of illuminate things. And actually, this brings up a great point. I don't know if you had another point, Toby, but because you actually interview later on in Strange Arrivals, Chris Carter and some other people from the X-Files about the reciprocal nature of the stories and entertainment and pop culture.
Yeah, so the second season of Strange Arrivals, and we'll probably talk about the specifics later, but is about sort of folklore formation, mythology formation, and looking at UFOs as being, modern myths. And one of the things I was interested in was how do, especially the X-Files, but other popular culture things, how are they both influenced by stuff that's going on in sort of the UFO community, and then in creating these fictional programs, how do they then influence both the UFO community and then the public at large, like how they feel about UFOs? So yeah, I did. I talked to Chris Carter, who's the creator of the X-Files, and I talked to Glenn Morgan, who's one of the lead writers. And it was interesting because they come in at a particular time, right, in the early 90s. And this was the David Jacobs, Bud Hopkins, this is their peak moment. And Chris Carter went and saw John Mack do some hypnotic regression with some people who are supposedly abductees. And that really sort of feeds into what they call the myth, X-Files. I came to find out is that there's two kinds of shows. There's the mythology shows, which is this sort of through current of the UFOs and the smoking man and the big plots and the government knows about UFOs. And then there's the monster of the week, which were these sort of standalone kind of clever investigations. And so the mythology stuff, a lot of it is the abduction myths from the 80s and 90s. And then they threw some other stuff in, like the Men in Black. There's some Area 51 things. I actually interviewed Chris Carter twice, and in the first one, I was like, these are the, I think I see these three things. Like, what else? He's like, well, no, you pretty much nailed them. It was, the Troika, it was Area 51, and then it was, I can't remember what the other one was, right off the top of my head. So I thought it was, I could never quite get, Glenn Morgan probably did the most, trying to get people to kind of reflect on sort of the inputs and then the outputs. And what was interesting was Chris Carter. And I said, just from the little bit I get, compared to something like a guy who did the X-Files, like you must have just gotten a barrage of stories from people and stuff. And like, did that sort of, just the sheer amount of stuff that you got, did that make you feel like you were more of a believer or less of a believer, or what? And he said, definitely less. Like the more he learned, the more skeptical he became. But I think it's that, the X-Files just does such a good job with that tension. And everybody, it's just funny. I mean, I don't know how much the like UFO community looks at the X-Files, but you talk, the skeptics I talk to, they all watched X-Files and loved it.
Yeah. And sorry, again, to your point, Joel, about how kind of inextricable real life stories are from fiction and pop culture. I was really, everyone's going to want to listen to your Chris Carter episode, and rightfully so. But I was really struck by Glenn Morgan. I believe that's what his name was. You said.
Yep.
Towards the end of your interview with him, he just gets really somber and like almost guilty in a way. You can hear it in his voice where he's like, I really hope what we didn't help drive this in any way, because that's really terrible if it did. He sounds very concerned.
Yeah, we were talking about conspiracies.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And I think we talked about it a little bit before we started taping too, and we were talking about QAnon and things like that. And I think he was just thinking about, again, like the X-Files being this big cultural piece of media that deals with conspiracies, right? And I think he was saying, I hope that what we inspired was more people looking critically at things and not people buying into conspiracies. Because he said, if I felt like I had some responsibility for, QAnon, or, I can't remember exactly when, I think this was before the vaccine, but like these other kind of conspiracy things, maybe conspiracies around the election, I would, that would be very troubling to me if that's our legacy. Which I thought, it was a very sort of interesting and kind of charged moment, I think. He was really, I felt was being very sincere about that.
Very raw. And I kind of feel that too, because I always tell people, like, even like if you go back to basic science and science fiction stuff, people will say like, oh, we really need to make sure there's better science in science fiction, all this unbelievable. And I'm like, well, I'm of the opinion, as someone who criticizes and critiques media, that the story comes first. And, if explaining the science or getting the science right isn't an important part of the story or detracts from the story, then that's fine. That's why people like us exist, to go on and talk to people about it afterwards. But at the same time, when you're putting it out there, whatever your intention might be, and clearly this wasn't anybody in the X-Files intention, but things are going to happen that are out of your control. And I can't remember if it was Chris or Glenn who said on Strange Arrivals that they ran into somebody who cited a particular part of the abduction lore to them, saying, oh yeah, I read this in National Geographic or something. And whether it was Glenn or Chris said, no, I wrote that. I literally put that into the X-Files.
Yeah. That was, he was talking about an episode where they find a worm, I think, like buried deep in the ice core in like Greenland or something. And somebody went up and said, oh, I read that National Geographic that talked about that. And he's like, no, I just completely made that up. And they're like, no, really.
Yeah.
So yeah,
It's
I mean, I think
amazing. It's amazing how the mind works, amazing and scary.
and that was from the second season, but in the first season, I talked to why am I spacing her name now? Elizabeth Loftus. Yes, thank you. So she's probably the countries of the world's leading expert about memories and false memories and things like that. And she did a lot of research around the satanic panic. Yeah. But it's about how malleable our memories are and how you can really strongly believe or have a very strong picture of something that happened, a very strong memory, when in fact it absolutely did not happen. And they just shown it again and again with different experiments where they will plant ideas in somebody's head that have no basis in reality, and then talk to the person like a year later, and that person will talk as though that was a piece of their own personal, like, lived experience. And so, the implications for that, like as a true crime person who, the number of people who get put away from eyewitness testimony from things that happened like a couple years ago, like that's nuts. Like there's, the chances for that eyewitness testimony being wrong is very, very, very high, especially if it's something you've been thinking a lot about, talking to a lot of people about, getting people's opinions about. So that, that's another thing for the list, right? Is memory and how that works.
Yeah. And people have been, of course, we love Elizabeth Loftus. Groups have been inspired by her, like the Innocence Project, who work to get wrongfully convicted people free from prison, doing great work. And actually, in the jury instructions, I'm not sure if it's automatic or if the prosecutor or if the defense has to ask for it. But built into the jury instructions in New Jersey now is telling the jury about the fallibility of memory and eyewitness testimony. So that's real positive consequences coming out there. And again, and to go back to the X-Files and to Monster Talk, if you listen to the Black Eyed Kids episode of Monster Talk, I had never really, like I said, my height of strange belief was in the 90s, and it didn't seem like there was anything about these black-eyed kids at the time. So like, I'm trying to, go backwards and trying to figure out where it came. And I think on Monster Talk, they argued pretty convincingly that it can be traced back to a very particular episode of the X-Files in the late 90s. I can't remember the particulars offhand, but yeah, everyone should go back and listen to it. Kind of like, we have a patient zero for the chupacabra too in Puerto Rico. You can trace the black-eyed, and more obviously in something that's completely fictional like Slender Man, we know exactly where that came from.
Right. And that comes up again with the Betty and Barney Hill was, one of the things that they have, that they sort of created, was the sense of what do we think of when we think of an alien, right? With the, big head and the big eyes and like very little nose or mouth. And that comes from Betty's hypnotic regression in her description, and then pictures they had drawn and this sculpture they had made. But then when people were trying to figure out where did that idea come from, there's an Outer Limits episode, and then I think even more convincingly a Twilight Zone episode that both featured very similar looking aliens that don't really look exactly like what Betty talks about, but you would describe them the same way. You would describe like big eyes that wrap around the head and like an oversized cranium and all this stuff. So again, it's like, did even just seeing like a still photo in the newspaper, like advertising the show or whatever, did that creep into her head and sort of influence what she talked about later?
Yeah. And it's important to note that just to speak one more time about that case, I remember reading that accounts originally came to Betty in her dreams. And it wasn't like a one-to-one. It wasn't like they came home and then the next day they were like, oh, I'm starting to remember some weird thing that happened. But I didn't realize until listening to Strange Arrival, or at least it didn't stick in my head, that it was a couple years before they went to hypnosis sections, right?
Yeah, it was 2 years. So in the first, like roughly a week or two after they get back, Betty has a series of dreams, and they're not sequential. They're kind of jumbled, but she writes them down in a document that she titles "Dreams or Recall," and it's the story about being abducted, and being, having medical exam and all that. It's basically exactly the story that she tells while she's under hypnosis. She wrote down 2 years before, and she talked to people about it, and had discussions about it or whatever. So it became ingrained.
Exactly. And people always say, especially in cases like this where more than one person have the same experience, quote unquote, same experience, they'll say like, well, how are they remembering the same thing? It's like, do you think Betty and Barney really didn't talk about this for 2 years to each other before? And again, not saying that they concocted a scheme or anything. This is just how human minds work.
Yeah.
And then you also mentioned, again, necessarily so, I think, about how Barney was always kind of characterized as a skeptic, but Betty, again, who only died very recently, she got into a lot of weird stuff that really, she was a pillar of the UFO community, and even a lot of the UFO people thought she was a little out there. So she really showed her propensity to believe as time went on.
Yeah, and her niece, Kathleen Martin, who really is sort of the main person sort of keeping this story alive, who I interviewed, very nice woman. But even she, in her book about it, sort of talks about how later in life, Betty started to make sort of outlandish claims. And again, you go to the archive, and she kept basically a notebook that purported to tell her experiences with UFOs and stories that she heard. And it's, these, I live here. These are the roads I drive on. And she's talking about having trucks pulled up off the highway and spun around and put back down again, fleets of UFOs coming off the ocean. It's just it's very strange. And to a certain extent, I don't know. I'm not trying to dime store psychology, but it does seem as though, her husband died, and this was a way for her to still have attention and companionship or whatever, was to be, an authority in the UFO world. And again, you can't tell the same story again and again and again. You have to up the ante a little bit.
And speaking of, so we started with Betty and Barney Hill, and then I guess we could characterize it as the bust of the abduction phenomenon might have come with who was the woman in New York who was abducted through her Manhattan window?
Linda Napolitano. That might be her real name?
Okay. Yeah, she went under a pseudonym.
Yeah, what was her?
It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, he got pulled out of her apartment building in.
Yeah. And somebody, who was it? Who was the government dignitary who supposedly witnessed it?
Yeah, the Secretary General of the UN at the time supposedly was getting a limo ride to the airport, and saw this woman being taken from her bed through her bedroom window into a UFO. And I think Bud Hopkins and another guy were kind of trying to get his attention, right? I think they showed up to the UN and tried to have a conversation with them, and we're sort of aggressively pursuing some kind of interview, which I'm sure he was just.
Well, I think you said in the podcast at some point somebody asked him about it, and he was like, "No, that didn't happen."
Yeah. He's got other things to worry about as the Secretary of the UN. Then.
Yeah, but to your point, I wonder if that really is the jumping the shark moment of abductions, because I think you're right. I don't really hear about them anymore. I took a long break for the last, I don't know, let's say 15 years, came back maybe 5 or so years ago. And then, it's again, you're kind of losing the context, but I was dropped into this thing. And it was like we mentioned before, it was like we were back to talking about boring things. It was like nobody was talking about abductions. We were talking about Navy videos again, which happens like 10 years, it feels like. So what's seeing the UFO history, what's your opinion of where we are right now in UFO history?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. You know, I think I mean, this all, again, it's like all, like things change, but they say the same. Like in the 50s, there was this real, you know, there were two camps. There was the contactee camp that was, you know, we're having these interactions with aliens and they have a story to tell us and all this stuff. And then you had the, you know, the nuts and bolts camp, which was people are seeing vehicles in the sky and we don't know what they are. And they thought the contactees were out of their minds. And so, you know, I think that there's been like this tension throughout. And I think, you know, at this point, it's like the nuts and bolts people, you know, are in the ascendancy with like Lou Elizondo and those guys and these, you know, purported Navy videos. And we're back to, there are things in the sky and people don't know what they are, and maybe they're aliens. And, you know, I assume the pendulum will swing back the other way at some point, you know, when somebody comes up with a narrative that kind of captures the public's attention, right? It just feels to me like it's competing narratives, and like whatever narrative seems to be the most compelling at a given time is going to be the one that gets all the attention. And then at times, you know, sometimes, you know, and this is sort of goes to what the part of what the second season was about. There are different times, different people are driving what those narratives are, you know, and for different reasons. But right now it seems like, you know, the Stars Academy people and Lou Elizondo and Leslie Kean and people like that are able to kind of push. And Leslie Kean was Bud Hopkins' girlfriend. You know, so she was, before she became a nuts and bolts person, she was definitely 100% in on the abduction stuff.
Well, here's the interesting thing, because I'll talk to some, probably not to the degree that you have, but I have a couple UFO researchers I keep tabs with. And Chris Rakowski tells me, he's up in Canada, that while the public facing part of ufology might be, like you said, Lou Elizondo and what are these craft? Are they aliens? Are they foreign powers? That once you get below that surface to the actual UFO community, it's gone full metaphysical. So yeah. I wonder if, like, obviously people have real experiences. Some people have real experiences, whatever they might be. But to me, it seems like the further up the chain you go in UFO celebrity, you have to start asking, how much do these people really believe what they're saying? And how much of it is a grift? Right. And I wonder if, again, I'm just completely speculating here, seeing the little bit of Elizondo's history that I've seen. I wonder if he's not just almost pure grift, just trying to get as much attention as he can and using whatever narrative he can to do so. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know a ton about him. I mean, I've read Sarah Skoll's book, and she kind of talks about how there's some real questions about who he is and what he's done. But it's interesting. I mean, he's driving the public narrative right now. In the second season, for the second season, I spent about 2 hours talking to Richard Doty. And I don't know if people know that name, but he was the guy who in the late 70s worked for the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and his job was to spread disinformation into the UFO community. And so there's a very good documentary about it called Miracle Men. It's not Miracle Men, Mirage Men. And so anyway, I talked to Richard Doty for a couple hours, and some of it makes it into the podcast. But you know, this was an absolutely intentional US government program to drive the UFO narrative by planning fake stories in the UFO community. I think essentially to cover up the stealth bomber, while they're running the stealth bomber out of, Area 51. They were worried that these UFO people who would go out there to look for UFOs would see stealth bomber, take pictures, whatever. And then at these UFO conferences, they're worried that like Russians or Chinese or whoever would have people in the UFO community trying to glean whatever information they could from these conferences. So the goal was to spread disinformation, to confuse things, and frankly, to make these people look completely wacky so that nobody would take them seriously.
Yeah, that's a really interesting series of episodes you did, because it really, I'm 41 now, so I remember when the Berlin Wall came down, but I was a kid. So, that whole spy versus spy stuff of the Cold War is not visceral to me, and probably for a lot of people. So it's difficult to put yourself back in that headspace where you had two immensely powerful nations doing every weird little thing they could to try to just get one little tiny bit more of information on the other. So of course it makes sense that there might have been Russian operatives in UFO groups for the reasons you say. And I said something in the American Horror Story article I wrote, because they talk about Area 51. I said something along the lines of the government was more than happy to let the world think that people seeing craft over Area 51 were crazy, and more than happy to let the Russians think those people were crazy, because then they weren't really paying attention.
Yeah, and it's I don't know how well known some of these stories are, but like the Paul Benowitz story, where they got a guy who was an electronics guy who was taking videos and capturing radio signals over Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, and thinking it was UFOs, and went to the base security and said, I think you got UFOs buzzing around. And instead of saying like, no, they're not UFOs, but I mean, Benowitz is a former Navy guy, but this is top secret stuff. So just stop taking movies and stuff. Instead, they said, oh, no, you're totally right. Those are UFOs. And, here's like a program that'll help you decipher their signals better. And we'll take you and show you crash wreckage and stuff. And they basically created this narrative for them that they were hostile, like there were hostile aliens that we were trying to make a treaty with. And, the stuff that he wrote about it, as his mental state was deteriorating, is really pretty awful. And it's a strange, it seems as though, the method may not have been, proportional to what they were trying to actually accomplish. But when I talked to him, Richard Doty's like, I don't know how any red-blooded American could possibly take a look at this and think it wasn't a success. Like, all right, man, I guess we'll just have to agree to disagree on that one.
Yeah, because I mean, Doty was responsible for the MJ-12 documents too, somewhat, wasn't he?
Well, he denies it, but I think people think that to some degree he was, because it ended up coming out through some of the same people he was working with, where he basically would make a deal without, going way into it. He would find people, especially this guy, Bill Moore, and say, I will trade you what the government actually knows about UFOs for information about what's going on in the UFO community. and so Bill Moore would tell him what was going on in the UFO community, and Richard Doty would give Bill Moore this disinformation to spread. And then in 1989 at a MUFON conference, Bill Moore, who people were expecting to give a speech about, the truth that he'd found out, instead said, I've been conned this entire time. And, and just created this big uproar.
Amazing. And well, the reason I bring that up, because it's kind of like, you could look at the X-Files entertainment of putting stuff out there into the sphere, with semi-purely good intentions just to do entertainment. But this is the opposite, where, somebody who's putting stuff out there with malicious intent, not really understanding the consequences, because there are still people today who debate the veracity of the MJ12 document.
Yeah. And I think Doty said to me,
so maybe as a government, you don't care what the fringe weirdos are doing, but that's really hurting people.
Yeah. And Doty said he still sees stuff like pop up, and he's like, oh yeah, that was one of mine back in 78 or whatever, still around.
Yeah, amazing. So we talked a lot about the first season of Strange Arrivals. Second season, we get into Rendlesham Forest. I don't know how much we want to spoil about that. If there's anything you want to say about it, just tell people to go listen.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say that the theme, again, as I said before, is like how did we get to where we are now with what the public thinks about UFOs? And what I'd originally wanted to do, we couldn't get the rights for this, is there's this great clip from Jimmy Kimmel's show, and he has Obama on, and he says to Obama, he's like, I can't remember exactly what leads up to it. He said, well, if I was president, the second after I got sworn in, I'd run back into the White House and I would, I'd say, give me the facts about Area 51. And, everybody laughs, and Obama's like, well, that's just another reason why you'll never be president. And what everybody knows what Area 51 is. Like, my mom knows what Area 51 is, and she's not that interested in UFOs beyond like my doing a podcast about them. My kids know what Area 51 is. Everybody knows. So how did we get to this point where that's such a sort of culturally understood shorthand for this sort of agreed upon group of facts about UFOs? And so I look at Rendlesham Forest as sort of like a microcosm of that. Like, there is the creation of this myth, which is that there's a thing that happened and there's a story about what happened, and then there's a skeptical explanation, and neither one of them has primacy. Like, there's still people who believe, there are people who don't believe, and that's where like folklore develops about things. And talk a little bit about Roswell, talk about how Project Blue Book, the way that the two panels were resolved, and how in these like little cracks, that's where myths have evolved, and stories have been floated, and some of them go away and some of them keep going, and what are the dynamics behind that. So that's what the second season is about. And that kind of, like I said, I made the first season without having this idea that I was going to have multiple seasons, that they're going to have a certain format and all this stuff. But that kind of sort of cemented the way these things kind of go, which is to have a sort of case study and then try and like zoom out a little bit and understand some of the dynamics and some of the issues that it brings up.
Also in season 2, quick shout out to Socorro, New Mexico. You've got a single episode on Lonnie Zamora and his encounter. Which doesn't really, I don't think there's anything totally new in there that a lot of people haven't seen, but again, it's nice to hear it sequentially, and it's nice to hear the people from, what was it, University of New Mexico saying, yeah, these kids did a lot of pranks.
Yeah, it was the New Mexico School of Agriculture and Mines or something.
Okay. Yeah. Again, another one of my favorite cases from the early times. And you mentioned Project Blue Book, which is something I wanted to ask you about, because of the early episodes, I didn't dig into this so I could get it straight from you. But a lot of the early episodes, you mentioned somebody working on the podcast who was affiliated with the Project Blue Book show on History Channel.
So I interviewed a guy. I don't know if did any of that stuff make it. I interviewed the guy who did the Project Blue Book show.
Oh yeah, I don't think so.
And that didn't make it. I was part of it was the audio quality was really bad, and part of it is again, I was trying to get him to reflect a little bit more about, you know, taking stuff that was out there and sort of the process of creating something new, and then how does that transformation change what people are sort of perceiving. And that wasn't very fruitful, I would
Okay.
say.
Well, now
There's another
now
guy I
my
talked to
interest-
who was part of the 1947 project, I think, which may be
No, I'm talking about the TV show, because that's really
Oh.
interesting to me. So actually, if you wouldn't mind, tell
Yeah.
us a little more about that. So he wasn't go now. What was his general attitude towards his role?
well, my sense was that he was a real believer, right? So that what he was doing was putting out a show that, you know, tried to make an action show out of things that were basically, in his mind, sort of true about the investigation into UFOs. So there's more like Alan Hynek being like fast with his fists and stuff like that.
Yeah.
In addition to, you know, this whole, I watched some of it, and there's a bunch of, it wasn't great, but there was some good Cold War stuff and some, relationship stuff. I also talked to a guy who wrote a book about the show Dark Skies. And I don't know if anybody watched that, but that was kind of this guy, Bryce Zabel, put together this show, this sort of like on the heels of the X-Files. And again, it was like trying to tell the Project Blue Book story, but from the viewpoint of aliens actually being already on the ground, and there being sort of conflicting groups within the US government about whether you acknowledge it, whether you don't acknowledge it. And, you know, the aliens are dealing in bad faith and all this kind of stuff. So I was kind of talking to him, this guy, Matthew Kresel, who wrote a book about it, about that show. And again, sort of the same type of thing. And I know Bryce, you know, I follow him on Twitter. I've talked to him a couple times, but not for the podcast. But he's a true believer, man. He's like 100% in.
Well, that's funny what you say about actually, I'm going to put a link in the chat. I did when that History Channel docudrama, I guess, Project Blue Book first started. I saw they were basically, it was kind of like X-Files in a way. They're doing Monster of the Week while also advancing mythology. And so they were going back to real cases. So I decided, well, we're going to take a look at every single real case they look at and, you know, talk about what we really know about it. And for a true believer who wants to get information out there, he really botched a lot of the cases. Like, of course, you're going to take artistic license in a TV show, but he's really muddying his own waters. Like the Betty and Barney Hill episode was nothing like what was actually reported, et cetera, et cetera. So
yeah. I mean, they kind of missed. I mean, if I'm remembering correctly, the Betty and Barney episode was an African-American couple. And
no, I think they were true to race at least. But, yeah.
Oh, they were? Okay. I might have watched something that I might have watched the wrong episode. There was one where they
actually, maybe you're right. I don't even
remember.
Hynek
hostage on an Air Force base, and then
actually, you might be right now that you say that.
Hynek lets his fists fly and, you know, recovers the weapon or something. I can't remember. It wasn't very memorable, quite honestly. But so it's interesting. Chris Carter and Glenn Morgan were obviously very smart guys, and, you know, they created this sort of lasting, sort of classic television series. And, you know, Mulder and Scully, I think, are sort of iconic characters. Just talking to them about, you know, what that was like. What was it like taking something like UFOs and creating popular entertainment about it, and what are you trying to get across? And for them, you know, it's largely, you know, it's entertainment, right? And keeping a narrative that people are going to be wanting to come back and forth to, but that part of what makes that narrative compelling is this tension between science and belief that's shown between Mulder and Scully, and how that kind of plays. And it's like Kirk and Spock, right? Where you can have, you're able to have these discussions about like in Kirk and Spock between like sort of the emotional side of people and the logical side of people. And instead of having like this internal struggle, in fact, you have like a Vulcan and a human like kind of arguing it out for the decisions. And then with Mulder and Scully, it's the same thing. It's like rational versus believer, and you can just have them talk about it, and that's how those issues come out, which is it ends up being good storytelling.
Yeah. By the way, you're right. I went back and looked, and the Project Blue Book show 100% did make Betty Hill black. I'm guessing to just skip over the issue altogether and get to the story.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that's a real, man, you're really seeing, like you just said, you're really seeing the difference in maybe not approach, but maybe desired outcome between X-Files saying, look, this is just a show. We want to tell people good stories. And this person who's like, oh man, we got to get the information out there. So yeah, it's as Joel said, and as we've seen, it's all incredibly so complex with a lot of different movies. Do you have any podcast recommendations in the vein of Strange Arrivals?
Well, have you listened to The Saucer Life?
No, I believe that's mentioned that on the show, right?
Yeah. So I can't believe I'm forgetting his name at the moment. Anyway, The Saucer Life. Oh, Aaron Gullius. But his thing, it's a similar. He's taking a look at UFOs as like, modern mythology or whatever. But he just goes through all these different, like an incredible number of, sightings, books, personalities, whatever. And I don't know. I find them very interesting. It's not like Strange Arrivals. It's not archival, and there's not a lot of sound design. I don't think there's really any sound design. But it's him talking about it. He does a lot of research. I think he's got a pretty good approach to the whole thing, which is that he doesn't spend much time debunking. He's just kind of telling these stories, and within the framework of its stories, right? You don't have to. I'm not trying to put it out there as something that's real, because he's going back from the beginning, with stuff that's just like on the face of it kind of hilarious, like the contactees, like did anybody really think that was real, or were they just kind of attracted by the philosophy that was being thrown out there, and so they're willing to kind of hold their nose and be like, all right, well, maybe it's not some guy from Venus, but I do think we should be more peaceful.
So I think we should probably start wrapping it up. If anybody has questions for us, use the raise your hand feature under reactions, and we'll get to you. I mean, personally, again, looking at the entirety of UFO lore over 70 years, I really miss that early stuff, because that's when it was wide open. Before, it was just like grays and everything, and the contactees were crazy. But you could see, because we didn't know at that point in time in the 50s, we didn't know what Venus was like. We didn't know what Mars was like. So it was most believable that there could be somebody living under the surface of Venus. And of course, pushed to other things as science marched on.
I see that Susan's mentioned a few times Skeptoid.
Yeah. And Dunning's been on your show a lot.
Brian Dunning is a voice on both seasons. I've talked to him a fair number of times. He's a good guy.
It's like you lost all that, like, I mean, if we can talk about like the Kentucky Goblins, or like the Flatwoods Monster, or even just like weird things of like seeing a strange 3-foot tall being on the side of the road. That was the cool campy sci-fi stuff that I really liked.
Joel, I see.
Joel, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. I was wondering how large this community is, and in a specific way, I mean, to the best that you would know it, because I think that would give me a better understanding of its influence Uh, that would be the number of producers of the data. Second would be the number of outlets, people that report it. I would think would be mostly that. And third would be the number of active consumers. And again, as generous as possible. I mean, I know, I don't know, but I would doubt that there's been any kind of a survey of this. But what would your estimate be?
Russ, that you probably might have a better sense than me.
Well, I missed a little bit of that question, Joel, but as far as, let's try to go backwards a little bit. I would say active consumers would be a much higher number than hardcore believers, which is I kind of mentioned that earlier about the difference between Lou Elizondo and his nuts and bolts approach to the core of UFO belief as it stands among followers and believers today. That's something, again, I think Chris Rakowski talks a lot about that. Yeah, because especially now when you see it on the news and it's like, oh my God, the Navy is investigating this, maybe there is something to it. I get the impression, I forget who it was I talked to, but said, most people don't really, if you go to the average person on the street and you say, what's your opinion on UFOs? They probably won't really have one. It'll be like, oh yeah, I mean, the universe is big. I guess beings could be here, but I don't know. But then they hear the government is investigating it, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, maybe there might be something more to this than just weirdos in a field, which is kind of dangerous because it must have been Mick West, because we had a big talk with Mick West a while back about the Navy videos and Lou Elizondo and all that. And yeah, I think that's it. It's kind of dangerous that way, because then it's, especially when the report was so slight. The report was like 6 pages of actual material. It was required. They had to issue it as part of the coronavirus relief bill for some reason. So it really seemed like a matter of, let's get this out there, let's get it over with. And then all these, again, potential grifters start making hay off of it. And all of a sudden it's part of the conversation again.
It was that.
I'm asking like for a number, and I know you can't, you cannot come up with anything like a specific number. But would it be millions of consumers, hundreds of thousands of computers, dozens of computers?
I mean, we can look at say the ratings on Project Blue Book, which were in the hundreds of thousands. But then you have to decide how many people are just there for the entertainment. How many people are there because they really believe it? How many
I know that. I know that.
I think that's the best you can possibly do, unless you have some other ideas, Toby.
Yeah, the only thing there've been various public polls. I remember like back in the 90s when I was in DC, there's some poll that said where they were able to pull from the data that more people believed in UFOs and believed that Social Security funds would be available for them when they retired, So I think one of the things that's interesting about UFOs, and I don't really talk about this in season 2, but I guess I could have, is that I think the vast majority of people are so low information on UFOs, and not that they should be big information, because who cares? But so that when they do get asked, like, do you believe in UFOs? It's kind of like, oh yeah, sure. Yeah, why not? It's a big universe. Or like Russ was saying, the government seems to be taking it seriously. Why shouldn't I? But again, it's just because there's not a whole lot of stuff out there. I think. I mean, maybe there is, and I haven't seen it, but that would be sort of popular reading. That's like a real sort of rational discussion about what's going on. I mean, what people tend to see is front page of New York Times or Washington Post, these articles that seem to indicate that something's going on, unless you read about it and actually think about it a little bit. And you're like, oh, well, you know, how much is $800,000 really in the Pentagon's budget? It's like nothing. It's not like the amount of, you know, it's stuff that's lost in the couch.
Let me say one thing, and then I'll actually come at it. I'll ask a different but similar question. I think you nailed it, actually, Toby, when you said I think most people don't have an opinion until you ask them, because they really haven't thought about it. But that also means that they can be influenced. As far as like hardcore believers who like, you know, consume all the social media, because there isn't a whole lot of popular media other than, you know, History Channel and stuff like that. You know, I would put it in the thousands. But I think another interesting question is how many people in the government actually care or believe, because we have this impression, again, because of the report, because of, oh my God, the government admits they're studying UFOs. Of course, why wouldn't they? You know? But again, on your episode of Monster Talk, which I'm going to recommend to people here to go listen to, Blake, he kind of goes through the whole. It's amazing how a small group can have a very large influence, because we can trace it back to Robert Bigelow, who was tight with Harry Reid, who is the chief UFO proponent in the Senate. And, you know, when you have somebody who goes to bat for you, you can get a lot of things done. So it's another thing for people who are just kind of on the surface level of this thing, and they say, oh, the government's studying UFOs. The question becomes why, and how many people are really pushing for it. And it seems to be a very, very small number with an outsized influence.
And I think there's also, you know, mixed into that group are people who are on, you know, House and Senate defense committees, who are seeing these reports of, you know, objects that they can't figure out what they are, that are around, you know, our fleet or whatever, and have a legitimate sort of concern, like a defense concern about that, like what is it, without having any thought that it's aliens or something. And then that gets, again, picked up and then sort of presented as, you know, here's Marco Rubio, he's really thinks there might be aliens. It's like, no, Marco Rubio, like as part of his job, like I'm not a Marco Rubio guy by any stretch of the imagination, but part of his job as a senator is these kinds of issues. So if he sees something about unknown craft buzzing around our Navy fleet, like that's something that he's got. I mean, that's sort of being responsible in his position. But that's not the way it gets messaged.
Yeah, and it's kind of I'm going to go to Susan first and then Rob, but it's kind of a doom to repeat history thing, because you do a great job. This is another thing that really confused me, just reading the literature, but you did a great job on Strange Arrivals talking about the actual Project Blue Book, the Robertson panel, the Condon Committee, and again, the history of government's thoughts about UFOs and whether they were important to study or not. And it kind of over and over again, they were like, all right, we've been over this. We see it's nothing dangerous. It's not foreign powers, enough. But now that's so far in the rear view now, these Navy videos pop up, which are very similar to previous Navy videos, previous Air Force videos. And people are like, oh, maybe we should look into this. Man, we did it 40 years ago. Yeah. So Susan says, if I can find the picture or the question here, why are men more attracted to the UFO culture? Is that true, first of all? And do you have any speculations on why that might be?
I don't know. Why are boys more interested in, like 3-year-old boys more interested in trucks than I don't. It's a good question. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, there's certainly prominent women who are in the UFO community on both sides of the issue. But it's definitely more guys.
I would be interested to see. I feel like I must have seen this stat in the 90s that breakdown between men who think they've been abducted and women who think they've been abducted. I don't know.
That's interesting. I bet you the abduction thing is probably has better female representation than men.
I think so. Especially when you get like messages from the aliens about how things should be going. That's, again, I can't point to any numbers at this moment, but I feel like looking back, that's how it usually broke down. Like if you were supposed to tell people about peace or brotherhood or anything like that, it was usually a woman saying it. And again, who knows why that is. Rob, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question if you're still there.
Hey, yeah, I gotta go, but great talk. I had not heard of your podcast, so I'm definitely going to check it out. So I just randomly looked at the Wikipedia page views for the Rendlesham Forest incident and Roswell incident. And for the last year, they both had about 250,000 each. One had 350,000. So of course, we don't know how many of those just random people who don't really care about it, skeptics maybe, and how many are believers. But just because of the people I know mostly do believe this stuff, I would say the large majority of that are believers. And that's in 1 year.
That's interesting.
That's a good stat. And of course, Rob Palmer works with Guerrilla Skeptics on Wikipedia, headed by Susan Gerbic, the most important project in skepticism. We thank you.
I've heard that somewhere. Thank you, Russ. All right, take care, folks.
Okay, thanks.
Did I miss anybody? Anybody else got a question? Yeah, I mean, if anybody has, go ahead and unmute yourself if anybody has anything to say. Toby, do you have anything you'd like to wrap up with?
Sorry, I just muted myself. Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I feel like we covered quite a bit of ground. Yeah, I don't know. Like, if people are interested, check out the podcast. It's definitely it's been an interesting.
I wonder what it's like. I wonder how my life would have been different if I had seen Ken Frazier on the holidays. So that's my fun.
Yeah, it's yeah, it was fun. That was like a fun thing in the first season was catching up again with him. His wife actually worked with my grandfather, which was our connection. But yeah, it was good. It was interesting. I mean, it's an interesting sort of subgroup of people on both sides. Like I talked to Stanton Friedman, who's quite a character. Oh, you actually got to talk to him? Yeah, I did. Like, months before he died. Yeah, he was very generous with his time. He was like absolutely as cantankerous as you would expect, and it would have been disappointing if he hadn't been, I guess. But yeah, no, he was interesting. He was a big Betty and Barney Hill proponent, and you got a sense of his sort of larger than life personality and stuff. So anyway. Actually, I do want to shout out, I believe this is the right book. I'm going to put it in the chat by Sarah Scholes. Here, which really examines the sociology and the culture of UFO belief. Is that correct? Yeah, I've got an interview with her. It's one of the bonus episodes. She's really good. Because a lot of times when I talk to similarly minded people, they'll say, well, we need to take UFOs seriously as a sociologic subject. And I'm like, I think some people are. Like, I think that's happening. Maybe it needs to happen more, but absolutely. I mean, that's the way to approach it. And I haven't really looked into that book other than what you said on the podcast, but I'm going to try to get my hands on it because it seems like the proper approach. Yeah, I think that's really good. Have you read American Cosmic by D.W. Pasulka? No, never even heard of it. Somebody mentioned it to me. I read it. It's very weird. It's not skeptical at all. It's a woman who's a religion professor at University of North Carolina, Wilmington. It's very weird. It's very different. It's like a very different take on the whole thing. I mean, it's supposedly about religion and UFOs, but it's really this very credulous take on UFOs and sort of being connected with these guys who claim to be scientists. I don't know. I was hoping maybe somebody had, because I want to talk to somebody about it, and I don't know anybody else who's read it. It's a very odd book. Anyway,
I'm going to throw another link in the chat to the book or a book review of The Intimate Alien.
Oh yeah.
What was his name again?
His name is David Halprin.
Yes. So I had somebody review this book before I heard you talk to him on Strange Arrivals. And as I saw the episode coming up, I'm like, does Toby know what he's getting into on this one? And well, you can tell us a little bit about Halperin's views.
So Halprin, I would say Halprin takes kind of like, I'm not a young expert, but I think he has sort of a Jungian take on this, and that, you know, UFOs are sort of projections of.
And he was just for some context, he was a professor of religious studies until very recently, I think.
Yeah, and like Jewish mysticism and stuff at University of North Carolina, and yeah, so he thinks it's all sort of these projections. He talks about the UFOs being mandalas, like, and that they're representative of death. And he takes a look at different specific sightings, including Betty and Barney Hill. He said like one of his more controversial takes is that for Barney, like his memory is actually sort of the collective memory of African Americans of the slave trade. So that's kind of his take. And I was really, so when I interviewed him, I had a really like good time talking to him, and I think it's an interesting thing to listen to without, it doesn't really comport with the way I think things work, but I'm happy to listen to other people's take on things if they're interesting. But I did want to kind of introduce like a different viewpoint on it that hadn't been covered in other episodes of the podcast proper. And I got a lot of like feedback about that particular episode. I probably got more stuff on social media about that episode than any other episode that we did. Like people's minds were blown, basically. So.
Well, what were they saying? Thanks for doing this. Why would you put this nut job on? What were they saying?
No, it's mostly thanks for doing this. Like, again, maybe not necessarily being like, I totally buy everything he's saying, but like, it's a very interesting perspective and a way of thinking about those things that I haven't before. And in some ways, again, I think it's, he's like clearly a smart guy. He's a longtime academic, and to me, it's just like a different way of looking at the way reality works.
Yeah, for sure.
Even if I don't agree with it, I think was just kind of interesting hearing about how he thinks it works. I don't know. I found it. I thought that interview was really interesting. I mean, I think of all the ones. I mean, obviously talking to Chris Carter and guys like that who are in the actually in the like sort of proper episodes. But again, I'll echo. I guess the last thing I'll say is, even if you don't want to listen to me in the episodes and the stuff that we kind of put together, I think the Carol Rainey interview, I found, and part of it is, we were doing it on Zoom, so I could see her and stuff, and was interacting with her. I found it in some ways kind of moving, in that she goes from really being, kind of a believer, and, she's in love with a guy who's sort of in the forefront of all this stuff. And then, the scales drop from her eyes and she sees what's going on. And she's got some background in science, and she's like, this is actually crazy. So listening to her talk about that and sort of, I think the regret that's in her voice, I don't know. I think it's like, when I was done, I've written novels. I was like, this would like make a good novel, right? Her story. I thought it was really compelling. So I guess that'll be my last word.
Yeah. And she, I believe it must've been her who talked about how Bud Hopkins and Dave Jacobs sat across from the table from each other at one point, and Jacob said to Bud, do you realize we're the only two people who know what's going on?
Yeah.
And it's like, that's also very telling, because when you get that Messiah complex of, I need to help the world, that's when things are really going off the rails.
Yeah. And she says that she's like, they didn't realize how dangerous that was.
Yeah.
This sort of self-reinforcing. Can you please repeat who it was you were talking about? David Halperin. So that's after that'll be one of the most recent episodes, probably.
Yeah. If you scroll up, Susan, that last link I put in the chat is about Halperin's book, The Intimate Alien.
Yeah.
Justin Mullis reviewed that for me. He reviews a lot of stuff. He's like us. He likes weird stuff, but he's more skeptical than anything else. So he was pretty disappointed with Halperin's book because he didn't really know how deep into the rabbit hole he was going to be.
Yeah.
Disappointed, but more like, oh, this is what this guy is about. I didn't realize.
Yeah. Again, I mean, it's an interesting, from my point of view, it's an interesting window on a way of sort of interpreting the world rather than like a definitive
when I was talking
explanation.
about when I was talking about mythology earlier, that was one of the people who was in my mind because he uses the word very differently than we might, because to him mythology is real.
Yeah. It's the Jungian archetypes, and you can have projections and they can be real things while also being a product of your mind, and it's weird. As so much of this stuff is, right?
It's weird. That's a good way to put it. Anybody else have anything to say before we release Toby? Thank you so much for doing this, Toby.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
But like I said, I didn't want this to be anything formal. I just wanted to talk to you, and I thought people might be interested to hear our conversation.
Yeah. So she says, are you really related to Ruth Frazier?
Frazier.
Yeah. So my grandfather founded this organization called Futures for Children, and Ruth was the assistant director. So they worked together very closely for years and years and years and years and years. So yeah, I know Ruth very well. I know Ken kind of well. Love her. Yeah, no, Ruth is awesome.
Yeah. It's amazing the connections you have without even realizing it. I think you could say that for UFOs and for life.
Oh, you wrote a book about Ruth's daughter, Lady Ganga. I've not seen the Frazier kids 30 years or something. That's funny. I'll check that out. Yeah. So it's been a lot of fun. I appreciate you inviting me.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Toby. I'm sure we'll be in touch again.
Yeah, 100%. Maybe we can do this after season 3.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.